So a few years ago, along with Jim Longhurst, I had a PhD student, Dotun Olawoporoku, who undertook a research project examining how we could improve the integration between transport planning and environmental management. And I think it was a very important study. Maybe some of you took part in it. So I'm really delighted to be here today, hopefully trying to assist in this dialogue between the two professional and academic communities. I've certainly learned a lot myself today, and hopefully I'm going to contribute a bit from what's happening from the perspective of strategic transport policy, which is the area I mainly focus on. So I think the session is built around behaviour change. I've actually got technologies but not behaviour change in my title. What I'm trying to do, I think, really is bring the two together in this presentation. Okay. So I'm going to start off just looking at perhaps what politicians will call going back to basics. What does air quality policy really need from urban transport policy? Then I'll look at the roles of behaviour change and technological transitions in delivering that policy. I'll give one or two examples of how we actually are undertaking behaviour change projects, but I'll focus the main part of the presentation on three technologies that are emerging in urban transport policy at the moment, and see how deliverable they are, and also some initial analysis of what the air quality implications might be. Lastly, I'm going to follow up with some indicative scenarios, qualitative scenarios, and conclusions perhaps would be a bit much to hope for from this very complex area, but maybe a few recommendations. Okay. So what does air quality policy really require from urban transport policy? And I think it's important to remind ourselves of what we are trying to achieve here. In some combination, I think you need each of these four. So less motor vehicle traffic might not be absolutely essential if we can come up with the absolutely perfect technology, but actually, generally speaking, and actually literally speaking, we need some room to maneuver. And without that, without some reduction in motor vehicle traffic, I think the task is going to be extremely hard. We need smoother traffic flow. And that doesn't always fit in with other transport policy objectives. Sometimes we introduce traffic lights to increase capacity. I hear we're now moving back to traffic lights after decades of replacing them with roundabouts as actually being a better solution, better for cyclists. So there are real conflicts in transport policy, and some of those outcomes don't necessarily fit with air quality objectives. Traffic redistribution. This used to be talked about more, I think, the idea that you could use urban traffic control systems to actually move queues around and spread out the pollution. I think, from what I've understood, the more we hear about whether there are safe standards of air pollution, then that will be a very dubious practice. But at the same time, if we're introducing low emission zones, that's bound to happen to some extent. So I put that with a question mark. There is an interaction there. And then, obviously, we need to address the emissions per vehicle, either reducing them or eliminating them. So that's our package, and I'll come back to that later on. And then, of course, we need to understand the particular geospatial context. There's a lot of technical due diligence, as lawyers might call it, here around making sure that the solutions really do work. And I'm not sure, in many cases, we really have the evidence. Okay. And by when is this all meant to happen? I'm kind of leaving you to populate this slide. I suspect we're already way behind schedule. I don't get a great sense that there are targets. If you ask me what our carbon reduction targets are, I'm pretty clear what they would be. But I've lost a little bit the focus here on what we're actually trying to achieve. And I think without clear targets, it's going to be problematic. And we've heard about the difficulties between forecast and actual and how we model, etc. But I think transport planners need to be clear about what the air quality targets are. Just generally improving is probably not focused enough. So how are we going to deliver an urban transport policy that is more oriented towards improving air quality? We have really two broad orientations as ever. We have behavioural change on one hand and technological solutions on the other. And I think most people accept that we're going to need some combination of the two here. The devil, of course, is working out exactly which behaviour change solutions, which technological solutions, and in what combination we put them together. So looking a little at behaviour change, first of all, we are about halfway, we being the Centre for Transport and Society with various European partners, about halfway through a European project called Evidence, which is reviewing, it's conducting 22 literature reviews on the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan measures as recognised by the European Union. There are actually 23, but when we looked at car clubs and car sharing, it's virtually impossible to separate them out. So you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to talk about 22 of those. I'll just mention 2 of these reviews, but they perhaps give a flavour. So the first one is site-based travel plans. This is essentially focusing on an employer, such as a hospital or perhaps a school, a major employment facility of any kind, and undertaking a number of often interrelated measures, such as encouraging car sharing, putting in facilities such as showers, changing areas that will encourage cycling or running to work. It's a small but non-trivial commute mode. Perhaps giving preferential parking facilities to people who car share, a whole range of possible measures improving public transport connections. So the review showed that there is a benefit. You get a very wide range of effects, though, depending on which study you look at, and it doesn't really make sense to take an average of the studies. So we're talking about a range of 4 to 18% of people reduce their car use. And overall, we did see a doubling in the use of other modes, be that walking, cycling, public transport. A doubling, of course, from a low base might not be very much in absolute terms, but important, perhaps, changes. Very wide range of expenditure went into these measures, range of between 2 and 431, I don't know what they spent it on, pounds per full-time equivalent employee. Not a particularly good link, it seems, between the amount spent and the effectiveness of the plan, so that's probably a good measure given the size of that higher figure. Some methodological concerns. I mean, this is difficult stuff, trying to track people's behaviour over time, often through an employee database, relying to some extent on self-reports, getting people to fill in travel diaries, which are quite onerous, but nonetheless, some good quality studies in there, where whilst there were some ongoing concerns about, say, selection biases, there was also confidence amongst the reviewers that the effects are real, at least for the evaluation periods. Because, of course, people change. Employees at a particular location change. So this isn't a fit and forget solution. One would have to go back and repeat this after a certain number of years. Those are the typical success factors. Willingness of employers to participate, driven from the top of the organisation down, that all makes sense really. Appropriate funding, use of the planning system, so a good time to do this is when an employer is perhaps looking to expand a facility. My own employer, the University of the West of England, has quite a good track record on building new buildings on its car parks. It's going to partly address that with a new multi-storey before too long. But restraint measures, often people do have free parking as a perk, and addressing that might be a good way forward. Improving the transport infrastructure, service improvements, and of course you've got to actually sell this to the people. So that's focusing on a particular site. The other measure I'll talk about is personalised travel planning. This is instead focusing on a household. So it's taking a household, looking at its travel behaviour, informing the household about other options they might not be aware of, discussing what things could work for them, often handing over perhaps a free bus pass or a cycle map or something like that so that people are better informed about the solutions. And we see here also some worthwhile changes. 8 to 12% in actual car driver trips. Mode share is much harder to look at. You've got to be really confident you've captured all the trips that household makes. Workplace travel plans are much easier to do. You've only got to focus on one journey, usually one journey a day each way. People have a habit of forgetting their shorter trips or occasional trips. So the methodology is much harder here, and it was felt the evaluations here were generally rather weaker, so there is a real effect. It's probably been overstated. Now, I missed out that bullet point there deliberately. The quality of the interactions is very important. One of the question marks to me is how many good people do we actually have to go out there and do this work? How deliverable is this at a national level? I know that those people engaged in travel planning are often very inspired individuals who work very hard. But it is hard work, and they're important, but I would say fairly small benefits as a result in the scheme of things. So, some challenges in rolling this out, and the size of effects alone probably not sufficient. Looking now at some of the problems that transport planners really face and the difficulty of behaviour change left on its own as a solution. Not that we're going to do that, something of a straw person, but just to remind ourselves that many citizens live in highly car-dependent, suburban, car-oriented development. This is Bradley Stoke from the 70s, 80s, 90s era in the North Bristol. And this is the kind of place they go shopping, typically. These environments send out the social message that the environment, and it is indeed, built around car use. Even if people want to change, it can be quite hard in these environments. Interestingly, this is done for carbon rather than air quality products, pollutants, but useful to remind ourselves that whilst urban journeys are important, many of those journeys start outside of urban areas, and actually most carbon emissions from car travel come from that mid-band, which is around 5 miles up to about 25. Typically the distances that are hard for public transport, particularly buses, to address, and generally beyond the range of even cycling, certainly walking. So we are a car-dependent society. I cycled here today. I cycle far more of my journeys than I walk, and I think it's very important that cycling and walking are promoted. But whether it's seriously going to result in a large amount of modal shift in that context, I'm not sure about. This is the mode split for actual journeys made, taken from the National Travel Survey, and you can see that for journeys up to a mile, we're already dominated by walking. It's already at 80%. We can't do much better there. 1 to 2 miles, cycling territory, definitely. Walking as well, perhaps. We could do a lot better. But if you remember, most of the fuel burn and carbon emissions, and therefore air quality pollutants, are being emitted when we're getting over that 5 mile band, and that is very much into car-dominant territory. And if we look at what's happened over the time since 1952, the period in which there was a real expansion in car ownership, we can see that actually it's not that public transport demand has collapsed. This is passenger kilometres. It's a rather different form now, so longer rail journeys and perhaps more shorter bus journeys. But there's no way that we can pretend that our current travel patterns are about loss of market share to public transport. We have totally changed the way we travel. That explosion in travel, in mobility around the car, can partly be addressed by public transport, but not completely. We simply don't have the capacity. We won't have the capacity, and if we did, it would be highly inefficient and not good for carbon or air quality. That's not to say, of course, that there aren't particular times and places. Metrobus in Bristol is probably a good solution. The city has a relatively low public transport share compared with other comparator cities. Therefore, I think behaviour change has got a role, existing technologies have got a role, but we also need to look at new technologies. But we need to be very realistic about the constraints of the different technologies and possible unintended consequences. I, of course, wrote this before our excellent presentation this morning on the diesel emissions, but an absolute clear example there of, well, perhaps many people knew that all along, but they weren't quite in the right places or didn't convince the right people. So we need to avoid this happening again. So I'm going to look in the second half at these three technologies: electrification, automation, and something that I'm calling collective mobility, which is really the use of the internet along with new ways of travelling. Okay. So we're having some presentations on electric cars tomorrow. Maybe they're going to answer all these questions for us, and my concerns are not as great as they are currently. Certainly there is an issue around carbon neutral electricity. I believe there's also a problem around distribution capacity. If everybody in London were to convert to an electric car, then the system would blow or something like that without spending a huge amount of money on a supergrid. That will take many years to deliver. The technologies are often dependent on rare raw materials. We've heard about platinum already today. Various other metals that could be in short supply or might be in the hands of people that we really don't want to be doing too much business with. Then there is the question of user acceptance, which I'm sure we will hear about tomorrow. What I'm going to talk about is the economics of this, and this is where there is a potential unintended consequence. One of the key disciplines in transport studies is economics, transport economics. And they've been drilling into the sector for years that the problem with car use is cars are expensive to buy and cheap to use. Yeah? People don't use public transport because they only look at the petrol cost, what they're paying out now. So let's promote electric vehicles, and I agree they have lots of benefits, but look at the economics of it. A higher purchase cost, so the person who buys it is more committed to the vehicle once they've bought it, and then a much lower cost per mile. Now, basically, in terms of transport economics elasticities, we talk about a 1% reduction in petrol price or an increase in petrol price, having something like a 3%, maybe a 6%, 0.6% effect in the terms of consumption. If we're talking about a 75% reduction, it's off the scale perhaps. Those elasticities no longer apply. But we're sending out a signal that car use is cheap. Therefore, we can expect, I think, quite a large rebound effect. At the moment, it's probably only limited by the battery technology unless you've got a Tesla. So why does that matter? We've got to consider the traffic system those people are going to be driving in. And I think there must be a point where we have enough electric vehicles which is sufficient to cause congestion and damage the overall emissions scenario, but not enough of them yet that we're actually cutting the emissions directly. So I think it would be an important area to investigate and understand exactly how those are going to play out in these emissions models. But we can't assume, at least in the short run, that electric cars will overall be a good thing in terms of traffic system emissions. Then, of course, there's still practical problems. How on earth are we going to recharge all these cars? If you look for pictures on the internet, you only ever see cars being recharged in people's drives, or if you go to the Netherlands, you can actually see them being recharged on the street. Here they're mainly in car parks or in private areas. It seems there's an issue with UK health and safety that we're not really keen to encourage this, and I can sort of understand that. But how is it going to work in streets where people are already parking at the margins of legality? They wish to recharge their cars with extension leads. They can't get access to the space outside their individual dwelling. I think there's a long way to go before we can really sell these vehicles mass market in practical terms. It works okay if you've got your own property with your own drive, off-street parking, etc. And Bristol's really been pushing, and I'll just pick Bristol because of the example I know, electric charging points. This is pretty precarious as well. I genuinely didn't expect this until I prepared this slide for this presentation. If you can make out the ones in red, those are the ones that are actually out of commission, according to this website, at the time I took this snapshot a couple of days ago. So if you had planned to stop at the Eastern in Gordano services on the M5 to supercharge your car, you'd have found that out of order, with not much place to go. And of course, we have something like 500,000 vehicles in the West of England region here, and, well, you can see about 50 charging points if they're all available. So it's a massive feat that if we're planning simply to convert all the cars to electricity. Even the government by 2020 only, well, the Climate Change Committee only expects 0.6 plus 2.5%, 3.1% overall contribution from electric and hybrid vans and cars. Okay. So that's electrification. Not saying electric cars are a terribly bad thing, but definitely something we need to look at very carefully in terms of the wider effects, and we need to look at the system-wide impacts and the transitions. One area I'm working on now is automation, and I think this is an area which has very much been discussed by technologists, and we need to have more of a public debate around. So, autonomous vehicles, we have this project called Venture. We're going to be trialling this vehicle mainly on closed roads, private roads, plus some work with off-road pedestrian area pods, and also instrumenting a double-decker bus. It's not going to be driven driverlessly. It's only going to be used as a data collection vehicle. A large consortium of various industry. So we're providing the social research capacity, and so I think it's my role to shout about this, because the DFT, Department for Transport, is very clear that the benefits are enormous. Accidents, 94%, etc., etc. Down here, they're also claiming that they're going to reduce pollution. So automation is going to reduce pollution. This is the road map produced by KPMG, an appalling term, isn't it? A road map for the introduction of cars. So basically, what they're telling you here, a wee bit complex, but there are 5 different levels of automation. The level of automation that might eventually create very large levels of benefit is way down there. So that's when a vehicle could be driven, well, let's put it this way, you could send out one of these vehicles with your 10-year-old in. They wouldn't have to have any driving license, any understanding of the vehicle. It would take them there, what you'd expect on a science fiction type program. That might be possible by 2030. Everything else up until then is basically making existing cars a little bit more automated, and it will start with trickle down from the high value models. There's already a Mercedes that costs about £200,000 that will follow the lane on the motorway, follow the vehicle in front, and so you could theoretically take your hand off the steering wheel. So it's going to take quite some time to come, and for many years these vehicles will be emerging in the fleet. Number of issues really. The technology, we're not nearly there, but again there are major problems around transition. Possibly having to redesign streets, maybe retraining some road users in how to use these vehicles and how to interact with them. And probably needing to change road user regulations. Might have to do some retrofitting so that vehicles can communicate with each other. And nobody knows how it's all going to be paid for. But there is a risk that this becomes a very important and significant discussion in transport policy. And there are implications much beyond the transport sector. You could see a total change in the value of land. If we really ended up in a situation that you don't have to park a car anywhere, you can just send it back to where it came from, or it goes and waits in a depot, then you've suddenly got all that land available. So it could have big implications for economics of urban land values. And also it might discourage walking and cycling. So again, we might see some increase in traffic. The third technology, which I'm calling collective mobility, is a number of different strands really brought together. You've got the supply and demand brokerage e-platforms, which will, in the future, you will send in a journey request, and it could be solved in a number of different ways and be offered different solutions by different modes, different routes, and you can choose the one that suits your circumstances best. Potentially this could be very efficient. Then we've got shared travel information. So you may have heard of Waze. This uses the mobile phone signal to send real-time vehicle speed, so you can find out real-time information about the congestion on your route and maybe change route. Other things like My Train Delays, where you can share your current delays so other people know what's going on. And then we've got this last one, which is the one I'm going to focus on, which is shared dynamically routed taxis and taxi buses. And I wouldn't include Uber in this. Uber's very much in the news at the moment, but of course that is essentially a standard taxi delivered slightly more efficiently by the internet. There isn't really any sharing around it. Potentially quite awkward for air quality, I would think, given that you're encouraging people with relatively old vehicles to come out onto the road, and with a lower level of regulation because they're private hire vehicles rather than taxis or hackney carriages. But what we're looking at now to run a trial in the North Fringe with another research project is looking at a dynamic taxi bus service. So you've probably heard of demand responsive transport, i.e. you can book 2 hours in advance. We're trying to get something that is much, much, much more demand responsive, so can start to really compete with the car. And the key benefit here is obviously to increase ride share. Creates a commercial opportunity as well for providers of the service. It can be linked in with an e-platform, so it doesn't just have to be this taxi bus that offers the service. This could be one of the different ways in which demands are met. So we're going to be looking at the North Fringe, which is that very low density environment I described before, and essentially there is demand for employment at the Avonmouth Docks area, but limited capacity to get people there. There's a lot of employment sites in that green area, and most of the people we know from employer databases who want to travel to those locations are living to the more rural and suburban areas to the east. So not an easy market for public transport. But with this system, we hope to offer a better option. So it's dynamic in that the system adjusts itself. We don't know how often it will be able to adjust itself. Probably in the early periods, it will only be a question of adjusting every week or every month. But over time, it learns where the demand is, and the routes will change so that more people are brought into the alignment. And it wouldn't always be the nearest current route which diverts to serve you. It will be an algorithm which calculates the optimal solution for everybody. Okay. So why am I telling you all this? Well, these 3 solutions, this is what I think they could mean for air quality. If we take electrification, the one clear benefit is going to be emissions per vehicle, no doubt about that. We can see, I think, some potential for traffic redistribution. If people are focusing on the range they've got left on the battery, that's going to influence the routes they want to take. We've also heard about how they're likely to be welcomed into the low emission zones, other vehicles excluded. So I think there could be some potential for traffic regeneration, given that a 1. In terms of traffic growth, I think that is going to be a negative. Transport economics tells us that we will get more traffic as a result of electric vehicles. And we're going to get perhaps problems with smoother flow as a result. I think it will be worse congestion, at least in the short run. If we look at automation, I've broken it into two. Automation levels 2 to 3 is what is going to happen in the next 10 or so years, 15 years, 20 years, which is basically cars will become easier to drive. They won't drive themselves, but a lot of the functionality will be taken over, such as the car automatically parking itself once you've identified the space. So if somebody doesn't like driving into a big city because they don't like parallel parking, no deterrent for them anymore. They just arrive, choose where they want to be, and the car will park itself. We get a little bit of a calming effect if they are running in automated mode, because that will take out some of the stop-start driving. Traffic redistribution, I think people will be keener to use routes they don't know well. So we might well see rerouting of traffic. As for emissions per vehicle, no reason why there should be much benefit, really. In fact, things might be slightly worse because we're filling the cars full of weight, computers, etc. So actually, that might get slightly worse. Once we get down to real automation, if it ever happens, then here I think there's a lot of potential for problems if we just replace all the current cars with automated ones. Could get a lot more traffic. On the other hand, if all the vehicles are talking to each other, it will be a managed system, so we could get smoother flow. And you will get traffic redistribution simply to spread traffic out and reduce congestion. Again, no particular advantage in terms of emissions per vehicle, really. It will be the same engine technology unless somebody intervenes to make that different in some way. However, a lot of uncertainty about the deliverability of that. Lastly, collective mobility, I think, has got a lot of potential to reduce traffic. Simply increasing car occupancy by 50%, i.e. taking about half the cars off the road, if you could do that, would make a massive difference. And smoother flow should be possible as a result. We don't really know about traffic redistribution. It would be a managed system, so there probably would be some of that. No particular advantage in emissions per vehicle. So the main point is that none of these technologies in itself is much good for air quality. What you really need is promoting a system which is going to be electric, has a high degree of system level management and automation, but is also collective. Okay. That's the only way you can get synergies. But interestingly, I would say collective mobility is the only one that we could actually roll out now. It's the only one without major technical problems. It's the only one where we don't need a lot of roadside infrastructure, which is required for both automation and electrification. And if we really want to address air quality, I think that's where we should be putting our focus. And of course, we do have these short-term unintended consequences to consider. And in the case of automation, I think they could be very large. The nightmare scenario would be we actually see little increase in sharing. We just replace all of the current vehicle fleet with automated vehicles. Maybe some of those are electric. We spend a lot of money on providing infrastructure for them. The urban areas become much more cluttered, and we have to regulate space more because walking, cycling, they will get in the way of automated vehicles to some extent. So the overall balance there could be very negative. The alternative would be something where we still continue to promote walking and cycling for the health benefits as much as anything. And the core of our urban transport supply is a mixture of buses, taxi buses, shared taxis. They're going to be smaller vehicles on average, dynamically booked, more flexible, increasingly electric powered and increasingly autonomous. This critically helps us to get, can't say this too loudly, helps us to get the labour costs down. Now there is an issue there, professional drivers no longer needed, but the real problem with public transport affordability is the cost of labour. Interestingly, we've done a small amount of work with citizens, and they really get this idea of automation, but only if it's shared and electric. And that wasn't a response bias. I was quite surprised to see this connection. Then I realised probably they're referencing things like the system at Heathrow their personal rapid transit system there, and there's another one being built now in the Middle East at Masdar. But they actually get it. And even those who don't want automation get it. They see that as the inevitable future. They're assuming this is going to happen. They just don't understand how difficult the transition would be to get there. But I think theory also supports this. I'm grateful to another former PhD student for this diagram. But behaviour change is much easier to deliver if it's done as a systemic change. If we think about social practice theory, then what we need to be changing is the meanings of what we do. So the shift to diesel was around understanding the meanings around climate change and overriding other concerns in that case. So that message got through perhaps too well. The competences we have, what we know how to do, and the materials, so the actual vehicles and fuels and the nature of the streets working. If we're changing all those together, it will be easier to create a new social practice than if we just substitute technology. We can't really expect there to be much change. So lastly, recommendations would be, I think, that there needs to be more serious attention given by transport policy in general to collective mobility. That would also help air quality. I think it's the only one that could deliver a real early change to the level of emissions. And in terms of promoting our electric mobility, I would say that the efforts and the grants, the subsidies, should be put into collective context, promoting electric car clubs and pool cars in organisations rather than promoting individuals to buy them. And there needs to be a more informed public debate, I think, about the benefits and costs of automation before we go too far in that direction. Thanks very much.
Duncan Laxon, Air Quality Consultants. A thought that came to mind when I heard you talking about electric vehicles is that you were essentially saying, or the message that came across to me was electric vehicles are going to be a very difficult route to substitute for petrol, diesel vehicles we have at the moment. You pointed to a very low uptake by 2020. Yet the Climate Change Committee, which you also referred to, has set targets for 2030 that I believe, I might have the numbers slightly wrong, imply that 80% of new vehicles coming on the road in 2030 would be electric vehicles. Now, that's a policy challenge that implies that they believe there is a way of delivering that because that's the route they want to take us. Yet I can see lots of challenges which you've identified that mean that's not going to happen in practice. Is it a good thing to have a policy challenge like that that's perhaps driving us in a direction that may not be achievable?
Well, this is why I was keen to understand what the targets for air quality are. I mean, clearly, by not achieving the European directives, in some way we've failed the target and there's the risk of court action. But what is the deliverable target that we could work towards, and what are the policies that would get us an improvement, say, in 5 to 10 years? Low emission zones are one solution, possibly, but obviously concerned about those. So I think there is a sense of, well, if we set a target, we'll try to get to it in terms of electric vehicles. But I just question whether that's the best way, and we need to understand what we could do with what we've got now, really. And I think a reorganisation of the basic problem is we use our vehicles too inefficiently in terms of the occupancy.